Welcome to my illusion. I'm going to talk to you about the origin and development of bluegrass music as a pure creative art form. It's something I got involved in the process of trying to learn how to play the banjo, and it's pretty much given the second half of my life something to think about here. Anyhow, I'll be talking about a century from the 20th century and the development of it. But I want to get some basic building blocks on the table here so you can know what I'm talking about, and we have a baseline understanding of what's happening here. The first thing I talk about bluegrass music as an art form that developed. And at the basis of that, I guess, is what is art? Now, I've got a real simple definition of that some of my philosopher buddies like to take issue with. But to me, art is that of human contrivance which stimulates the human intellect. To me, art is that of human contrivance which stimulates the human intellect. What proves it to be what it is nothing but time. That same Mona Lisa that captured people's attention 300-400 years ago is doing it today. And the tunes and the melodies of Stephen Foster are still being sung today. Time proves it to be what it is. And we're going to be talking about time here, about a century. We're going to talk about a century when a country became a nation and then became a military and economic empire. The development, the changeover in a country that went from 90% rural population, 10% urban, suburban, to reversing that figure in 100 years. We migrated from the country into the towns. Factories kicked up after World War I, and we had tapped our industrial potential out there and seen what could be done all of a sudden, and we had gained a lot of wealth out of that war as well. Everything got kicked into high gear, and the manufacture of cars started happening in a big time way by the mid-20s, and all this other stuff going down. The advances of the 20th century are absolutely amazing. The first performers I'm going to introduce you to from that Celtic descended region of the South used to go to their gigs and on horseback or riding wagons. We're going to talk about a century in which they went from those wagons and the horseback into cars, into stretch limousines, into buses, onto airplanes, and took advantage of all the improvements in mass transportation. Also in mass communication, they bridged the gap of the time right as radio was coming in, onto television, some into movies that was done. The recorded media, when some of these guys started recording, they just dropped a needle on an acetate base and cut the record as they were doing it. The one artist in particular that I will talk about is a guy who made it from those acetates like that all the way up through the vinyl multi-tracks, then into the cartridges and the cassettes and on the CDs, and before his 60-year recorded career was over with, you could digitally download him. That's coming from a guy who started out his career going out to play square dances and shows that were lit by kerosene lights. It'll be an amazing time that we talk about. It's a time of the migration when the more independent country sort of fella got to town and had to learn how to adapt to society there in the cities. You know, it started happening. 1924, Emily Post came out with her book on etiquette. was one of those ways. Another fellow recognized the integrating thing of bringing it in. Square dancing had fallen out of favor. It had been big back in the 1800s. It was a combination of a bunch of folk dances where some guy stood on the side and called out these particular dance moves, and those on the floor executed them. But by the mid-20s, the Charleston was in. And one of the things that, of all people, Henry Ford did was sponsored square dancing. And he put up a substantial amount of money to reinvigorate it, a social activity where the people coming from the country to work in his factories could integrate with those people already inset in that urban environment. Interesting times we'll be talking about. I'll do the best I can to stay out of the politics of it all and just try to concentrate on music. And mostly it'll be one particular of the genres that came from a 7-state region of the South, east of the United States, that Celtic descended South, Virginia, the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. From those states, we have blues music coming. A little farther south down in New Orleans, we had jazz music evolve out of there. We had country music come out of the Southeast. We had bluegrass music come out of the Southeast. We had rock and roll music come out of that Celtic descended South. The musical culture of this part of the world is as rich as any place that's ever been. Interesting, interesting. A lot to do with the people. And I'll try to tell you as much as I know about that. I lived through the majority of the second half, or the second half plus a little bit of the 20th century. And I talked to a lot of folks, my grandparents, folks of their age who were actually born before 1900. So most of what I know about the whole century I've either gotten by talking to old folks' history books, or in the second part of it, and especially with this music we're going to talk about, I was in amongst it. Anyhow, I'm going to start the program off here today with a little example of some string band music that was popular down through the Carolinas, especially Virginia, northern Alabama, north Georgia, and everything. And the string bands that base themselves around old-time fiddle music. Here's a tune that we're going to play for you right now by J.E. Maynard's Mountaineers called John Henry. And it's interesting. One more aside before we go into this. And that is, I'm going to be talking about how each generation changes history as we go along. It's since we've developed in our culture, and I'll be talking a lot about this when we get to the 50s, we developed some kind of fascination for that rebel without a cause out there. Youngsters decide every so often that they got to reinvent the wheel and stuff. So as a prime example of this, here is one of the earliest of the recorded versions of an old tune called John Henry. And I don't know exactly what key they're playing it in. Sounds to me, well, if it were in the key of G, when John Henry was a little bitty boy, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it goes to a C chord there. Later on, none of the versions of John Henry that I played in my Fiddler's Convention days or anything had this, but this music all predates them. So here's J.E. Maynard's Mountaineers with John Henry.
John Henry was a little boy, Lord, he sat on his papa knee. Lord, he picked up a hammer and a little piece of steel, says, hand me the death of me, hand me the death of me.
Now this is a sound you may recognize because it's alive and well, and you can go down to Galax, Virginia every fall and get yourself a big old dose of it. When I was a young fella, most of the bands down there declared themselves to be bluegrass. You didn't have a whole lot of these old-time string bands that were active. That in the last 40 years has reversed itself. You've got a lot of the string band heritage being carried on. through there at Galax, at Mount Airy, some of the other fiddlers conventions down in that region. Well, there you have it with old J.E. and the boys. His brother Wade Maynard was a banjo player of note, had an old Gibson Granada banjo that was talked about in a lot of banjo collector legends. All right, now if we move on up to Southwest Virginia, we got another one of those early recorded groups up there. This being A.P. Carter and his wife Maybelle had themselves a group, the Carter Family. And one of the tunes, or one of the songs that they did was called The Wildwood Flower. It sort of became a guitar player's anthem for all the country boys up through the mountains of Southwest Virginia, or anywhere in this area of the Appalachian Mountains. But The Wildwood Flower, I guess every person that ever picked up a flat top guitar, it was either that or the steel guitar rag or the guitar boogie back in the 1950s. That's, I remember hearing a lot of young folks playing on stuff like that.
Oh, I'll twine with my mangles and waving black hair.
Okay, one of the first of the recorded country guys, the guy that's the acknowledged father of country music, was from down in the Deep South, down somewhere. The museum to his life is down in Meridian, Mississippi. But he was called the Singing Brakeman. He was one of those guys that had the fascination with the rails and all. And his name was Jimmy Rogers. And he became quite popular everywhere, made lots and lots of records. One of the you know, when those records started contributing to mass popularity, or contributing to the sale of these individual artists, you know, getting them out to where they could achieve celebrity with what they were doing. Found a few guys that were recorded very prolifically, Jimmy Rogers being one of them. I'll be talking about Louis Armstrong a little bit later on, a massive amount of recordings by him in his early days, as with the focal point of this whole presentation, Bill Monroe. First mention his name today. I've avoided that pretty good. Anyhow, here's Jimmy Rogers with a tune that we'll be revisiting after a while in his Southern country blues style.
Good morning, Captain. Good morning, shine.
As I said, we'll be revisiting that tune in a few minutes. Right now, we're going to play one of other Jimmy Rogers songs too, and this is an attempt to show you that in the day and time that these recordings were made, there weren't genre distinctions. And there weren't distinctions in the band of a band putting itself together in a particular ensemble of instruments. These things tended to be all-inclusive since there were no genre barriers out there. And if you'll notice in this tune, which was one of Jimmy Rogers' most populars, called Waiting for a Train, you can hear horns in it, and you know, throughout his music, all his recordings, he would have horn sections, he'd have Hawaiian guitars, just lots of different things. But again, here's one of Jimmy Rogers' more popular tunes called Waiting for a Train.
All around the water tanks, waiting for a train.
All right, there you have Jimmy Rogers with Waiting for a Train. Now that's sort of the state of recorded country music when there came along two young fellas from the state of Kentucky. And they began their recording career in 1936 in Charlotte, North Carolina. Already the mandolin player in this duet is showing signs of the maestro virtuosity he was going to bring to the table in his career. So here are the Monroe Brothers, Charlie and Bill Monroe from Rosine, Kentucky.
Like old horizon, surely is a train, boy, surely is a train. Like old horizon, and it surely is a train. I'm on my long journey home.
All right, I'm going to give you a little bit of background now, and this is going to take a while, so I hope you packed your lunch for this one. The Monroe Brothers came from near Rosine, Kentucky. They were from a family that had 8 children. I'll be talking most especially about Bill, but in a little bit of background to the Monroes, and I would think that anybody who wants to find out a whole lot about their early history and everything needs to read Richard D. Smith's book, Can't You Hear Me Calling? But James Buchanan Monroe was married to Melissa Monroe. That was Bill and Charlie's father and mother. James wound up with a 690-acre farm, 90-acre farm near Rosine, Kentucky. On that farm, he had 3 working sawmills and a coal mine, what they called a pony mine back in those days, and a substantial amount of the land was under crop. It sounded to me like that was an ongoing enterprise, but one of the curiosities that struck me was none of the children stayed on the farm to work it. We have a situation where Melissa's health began to deteriorate while she was still in her 30s. The house was built in somewhere, James Buchanan built another house somewhere in I would think between it was about 5 years before Bill was born. So it had been 1905, 1906, somewhere along in there to accommodate this illness that Melissa had. And both Bertha and Bill were the older children, Harry, John, Speed, Maud, Butch, and Charlie had been born in a cabin. But Bertha and Bill were born in this newer house. As I said, it was an ongoing enterprise. Bill was born when his mother was 41 years old. His eyes were crossed. I think it had to do with his left eye being drawn inward, and from Richard Smith's description, whatever changes that makes in the brain, if it isn't corrected by age 5, those changes become permanent. I will talk about Mr. Bill's vision as we go through this presentation. But in just looking at the dynamic in that household and the difference in history, and that's what I'm sort of going to talk about here a little bit. Some of the first of the stuff that I read was in a Jim Rooney book called Boss Men that he wrote on Muddy Waters and Bill Monroe. And then I heard some tapes of interviews that Ralph Rensler had done with Bill in the early part of the 60s, maybe late 50s, early 60s, when he was instrumental in resurrecting Bill's career as a professional entertainer. But in trying to understand in that household, what it was like that formed him into being that isolated loner that he always was, and that's brought up a lot in people's writings about him and their conversation about him. Just what made him the person that he was. And having myself had to develop some kind of understanding of psychology, I find that those early years of development are most influential. And especially in Bill's case, as I'm talking to him about later on, because he attributes a lot of his success to lessons that he learned from his father while working in that family enterprise. And we'll be talking about that work as well. But to get on with his childhood, and from what I know about it and my particular slant of looking at it, is he was born on September 13th, 1911. He had one sister who was about 3 years old at that point, and another who's about 13 years old. And As I said, he had a mother whose health was in decline. In looking at that whole family dynamic, Bill always portrayed it as he was somewhat ignored by the older brothers and sisters and stuff like that. But due to the general way he conducted himself, I've got a feeling he may have been a bit pampered as well in the general scheme of things for that day and time. You know, just look at the dynamic of the two sisters. The youngest sister's still playing with baby dolls, and there's a live one done come in the house. The older sister's getting of an age at that time that girls were thinking about getting married and having kids of their own. The dynamic that's happening in that house with these things being there, even if the bigger brothers did ignore him. When Speed came back from World War I, supposedly they walked all the way from the train station home, and Bill said Speed never spoke to him. You know, this whole thing of him walking those railroad tracks out of fear of ridicule from other youngsters or whatever it was. His saying that he used to hide under the back porch when company would come to town. All that stuff goes in. Just a lot of stuff to think about when you think about the development of a personality in a youngster. That youngest child, that whole deal right there that they've done psychological studies on. He was one of them. And over and beyond the psychology of the normal one, he had these physical malformities that had to be dealt with as well later on in his life. The severe overbite that caused him to speak with a lisp. The crossed eyes, which prevented him being as active in sports as he would like to have been, most especially baseball. One thing that isn't talked of very much, and later on, you know, I'd spoken about Bill being a virtuoso. If you look, there's a technique of his. Let's see, let me go up to the close-up picture over here. I can't see which one's which. But in Bill Monroe's mandolin tremolo, the plane of the back of the hand and the arm stayed like that. That tremolo was all in the wrist. He didn't use the weight of the hand turned around like this to create that rhythm. It was all as disciplined as Earl or J.D. Crow's finger-picking method was. His was as disciplined in the wrist. That's a classical technique. Now, Monroe became this fabulous musician and wonderful artist, composer, everything else you can be in music and everything. But somewhere or another, he got a glimpse of that. So any historians that are out there, Bill's father, one of those 10 folks that worked for Bill in the sawmills and the pony mines and all, was named Hubert Stringfield. And he was supposedly a classical mandolin player. I would suggest that when it came along and Bill had to take up mandolin because the fiddle had already been taken and all this other stuff, that may have been the guy that Bill learned that right wrist, the right hand technique from, that enabled him to play the way he did. Because it was a departure from the typical country mandolin player of the day, you know. And later on, when he developed his rhythmic playing and the playing the leads with the downstrokes more like a blues player, it all changed somewhat, but he never lost that perfect flat playing. He used to use the flat of his hand right there on the bridge to mute it some, to change the tone of the instrument. It used to tickle me to death watching him feed back. When he caught himself a hot mic that he could feed back, he would play it because he'd get the places on the top of that mountain or that mandolin where he could feed the sound right back into the microphone. You know, he could reflect a monitor's sound back into that microphone and get feedback with it. And he played with that. You know, that was one of his techniques. It was kind of neat to watch. Anyhow, where I'm at. All right, we've got a Monroe side of the family and we've got a Vandiver side of the family back then. The Monroe, James Buchanan, from what I understand, was a, you know, not that he was austere, but he was a steady, hard-working man and everything. On the Vandiver side of the family, there seemed to be a bit more frivolity. Most of the music around the house came from Melissa, and she played a variety of instruments, accordion, lots of other things around. And she had a brother named Pendleton Vandiver, who'd drop by, and he was a fiddle player. Now, some way, somewhere, somehow, Uncle Penn had fallen off his horse going to some guy, it may have been named Clarence Wilson or something like that. I remember a name back there somehow, but he had fallen off and broken a hip that never healed itself properly. He lived down near the town of Rosine on a little hillside that you could actually see down over town from. But anyhow, Bill's mother passed away when he was 10 years old. What I'll bring into that is, I heard it said that he quit school somewhere about his 3rd or 4th year in school, around some folks. That would put him having quit sometime about the time Melissa passed on. There was a lady in Rosine, Kentucky, when I did some work for the folks up there that had the foundation that sort of rebuilt the old home place and everything. There was a lady up there at that time who was, she must have been in her 80s or 90s, who said that she went to school with Bill Monroe when he was in the 9th grade, and that he said he was going to be a professional musician so he wouldn't have to continue to do the work that was on the farm out there to be done. If that was the 9th grade, that puts him somewhere in the age of 15, and that's the age he was when James Buchanan died. So either he went to school until his mother passed away or till his father passed away. That's part of the early beginnings in his education. Because in his writing and everything, he didn't seem to be all that well educated in his doing. But, you know, when James Buchanan passed away, I think Bill was left there on the farm, that substantial farm, by himself. All Harry Speed and John and Maud had all gotten married and got their own family started and everything. Butch and Bill had taken off to Detroit to get a job. Again, that migration of the country people into the city, because these guys, even though that farm sounded relatively prosperous to me, don't sound like any of the Monroe kids wanted the work that was there to be done. So anyhow, Bill, after James Buchanan died, Penn used to go up and look after him a little bit, or they farmed him out to a couple of the older children's households, I think. I don't know what the deal was, but it didn't last. But the result was, from the time he was about 16, he wound up moving on down to Uncle Penn's house and stayed with him until he was 18 and moved north to join Charlie Birch and Bertha, who were living in the Hammond, Indiana area. But during that period of time, Bill got more and more exposed to music. He was, you know, part of Birch's, or not Birch's, but Penn's accompanist going out, and he also made acquaintance with an old fellow named Arnold Schultz, who was a black fella who used to ride the rails through Kentucky and everything. A lot of folks, you know, I don't know how the guy played. I got no idea. Everybody says that's where Bill got the blues side of what he did. I question that, because Merle Travis learned how to play the guitar from Arnold Schultz, and there ain't a whole lot of blues in Merle Travis's country music guitar playing. I would suggest that a black fella from Kentucky wouldn't play at the same rhythm that a black fella from Vicksburg, Mississippi would. It's like the difference today in analyzing Bill Monroe's mandolin playing and Mike Compton's. And I set them down 3 feet in front of each other in a recording session for 2 days. Once the time they're as different as daylight and dark, the rhythmic undertow of their playing. So anyhow, that's a left field aside, but nonetheless. Anyhow, Bill got a lot of experience in at that point, playing for the square dances and all of that those guys did. You know, there are stories about Uncle Penn, and Boss Man Bill used to say, Bill said that Uncle Penn would leave the house with little or nothing on Monday and come back on Wednesday or Thursday leading a horse or a cow. In the Can't You Hear Me Calling, all of a sudden Uncle Penn was leaving the house with a few trinkets that he was able to trade and parlay into that. You got one of 3 scenarios up. Maybe he was that trader. Or maybe he was a horse thief. Or maybe he was a gambler, because Bill Monroe loved to gamble. as much as anything. It didn't matter whether it was fighting roosters, whether it was a deck of cards, whatever it was. He loved a game of chance. That may have been, as I said, the Vanderver side of the family seemed to be a bit more frivolous. Where James Buchanan had been, in Richard Smith's book, they talk about how James Buchanan would take a shot of whiskey every once in a while and drinking. But he never seemed to be somebody that led to, a situation of frivolity. So, that's what Bill carried with him throughout his career. He was, for what could be said about what little alcohol he ingested in his entire life, for the most part, that had nothing to do, had no part to play in his career, either positively or negatively or any other way. It's just something that he stayed away from. Let me see now, where am I at? All right, Charlie and Butch have gone to Hammond, Indiana, or Detroit, Michigan first, and they wound up back in Hammond, Indiana, and somehow or another Bertha's moved in with them. And along about the time Bill gets 18, he decides he's headed up there too. This is in 1929. 16 years after them boys from Jekyll Island figured out how to get all the money away from the United States. 16 years it took to take it down. Anyhow, Bill shows up when the Depression's starting to happen. Now, if you look in 1929, there's a Great Depression happened. If you look in your history books, most of them pictures, you see these long bread lines that they used to have and everything. A substantial amount of those were made in Chicago. When they showed pictures of the Depression in New York, they would be down somewhere taking some kind of shot of Wall Street or something in that financial district. When they showed you the soup lines and the bread lines, those were in Chicago. But when Bill went up there, he wound up getting a job. Now, this job was basically as a janitor. He had to clean out oil drums. That was a portion of his janitor job, and ship these oil drums from one place to the other, and that was where he exhibited some of his physical strength, and later on in life he would talk about that. The same way he would talk about driving the cross ties to the lumber yard for his father, that they cut out. It's my opinion, in looking at a lot of the way that Bill described his work and everything, the work that his father had to do, to me, I think it was, in a lot of cases, and I hope this isn't sacrilegious to anyone out there, but I think it was just busy work that his dad gave him to do to keep him out from underfoot. There was never any talk of him working around that sawmill, getting in any position there where he could jeopardize life or limb near any kind of machinery, either in that sawmill or in that coal mine. The discipline of his work was the normal discipline of a youngster on a farm who had to learn to do chores and participate in the family activity. Most of the time back in those old days, coming out of the 1800s and everything, you had those large families. It's basically so Daddy could get some help on the farm, And that wasn't something that was happening, with James Buchanan hiring 10 outside workers and none of the children seeming to be interested in maintaining the family enterprise there. All right, so we got Bill going up to Hammond, Indiana. And he's got him a job there in that Sinclair refinery. And he and Charlie start this in 1929. Somewhere they played their house parties and everything. And Bill got exposed to music. Now, I'm going to talk to you a minute or two about this thing called jazz music that started up down in the New Orleans area, and it started making its way up the Mississippi on those river boats, and eventually got up to Davenport, Iowa, and caught the ear of Bix Beiderbecke up there, and it rode up the rails and everything and all these other rivers, and it wound up making its way up into Chicago. Well, that thing that in New Orleans had been pretty much free-form improvisational from the get-go, sounded like everybody was improvising, still does in the Preservation Hall Jazz Band to me. But by the time it got to the Chicago area, the music had changed in the sense that the whole ensemble sound was a bit more subdued and a bit more organized. You actually had horn and string sections in those things that were playing in harmony with each other and not just flying all over the place. But you had that ensemble playing that, and then when it came time for that improvised solo to happen, you had an individual step forward to do that or step up in the bandstand to do that. That's something we'll revisit later on at the Grand Ole Opry that was brought there in 1939. Another evidence that Bill during this period of time was exposed to the speakeasy music of that day and time was that when he was recording the Uncle Pen album, he did this tune and said, "I've been holding on to this for 40 years and I'm not going into that voice. I've been holding on to this thing for 40 years before I recorded it." And he called it Milenberg Joy. Well, that tune was being played in Chicago during the period of time that Bill was there by a group called the New Orleans Rhythm Kings. And the tune was written and performed by a fellow named Jelly Roll Morton. And if you want to listen to him, it's the same tune. I know Bill had that exposure. The chop time that he plays in his Western swing music is much more akin to the music that was being played in Chicago speakeasies than it was in the Bob Wills music that he was trying to emulate when he did Goodbye Old Pal. Listen to his rhythm in that. It doesn't have the fluidity of the swing of the Western swing music. Instead, it's choppy, and that choppiness, you can hear it in a lot of 30s, 20s, and 30s jazz bands, especially the ones that had made their way north. Okay, so we got him 1932. Here we go around. We got the World's Fair coming to town in Chicago. Charlie and Bill have been trying to get on the WLS Barn Dance, but they've already got Carl Davis and Hardy Taylor there. So they ain't going to hire another act. That's something that'll play in a little bit later in the 50s when we got Martha White sponsoring one of Bill's incarnations of his Bluegrass Boys, who decided they wanted to come back to the Grand Ole Opry as a separate act. And one fellow, one emissary from the WLS Barn Dancers, somehow or another, since the World's Fair was coming to town, Charlie and Bill got him a job dancing with the WLS Barn Dance Ensemble when they went there. You know that thing I was telling you about, the social skill that people learn to help them integrate in society. And here them boys were, they were professionals at it now. They wound up doing that for the better part of 2 years. 1932 to 1934, while that was going on. Learning about music, they're active, you know, musically. It pretty much drops itself down when they finally got a job to offer to go play music rather than dance to it. Oh, the other thing that I want to tell you,
Excuse me.
and the rocket's red glare, da 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 da. Anyhow, I lost it again.
So he got a job as a dancer.
Yeah, they got this job as a dancer, and it's a funny thing, the instrument configuration of the band that played for them was fiddle, mandolin, guitar, bass, and banjo. That form would be resurrected again in 1945, complete without accordion. And we'll be playing some of that in a few minutes. The neat things that came out of that square dance ensemble business is they got exposed to a guitar player named Doc Hopkins. And when the first Bean Blossom Festival was held, Bill booked Doc Hopkins on the show. And when Bill introduced him, he credited Doc Hopkins with the G-Run. He said that Doc Hopkins had been the one that first place that Charlie had ever heard it, and that's where Charlie lifted the G-Run, which became, and I'll be explaining this in the music, it became the principal form of punctuation in bluegrass music for a long time. You had the catchphrases and entire tunes of Wheelhouse and Uncle Pen that depended on that G-Run. They had their first radio program out there as a duet, and they wound up working for a period of time in the Nebraska and Iowa region. But by 1936, they had made their way down into the Carolinas. So now, you know, when we're looking at this thing and thinking about these guys, here are these guys from that farm enterprise out in Kentucky, country boys, horse and wagons, and all of a sudden they've made their way to Chicago and the hustle and bustle of the big city up there and tuned into that, and now they're in automobiles running all over the country because they put some miles on some vehicles. And back in those days, you know, your radio show, you didn't normally get paid any money for that. You wound up, those were just your marketing vehicle for your live performances. You do a morning radio program and work some high school in the local county there or something around. You know, that was your way of getting crowds out to that. Some folks did get sponsors. Charlie was able to do that even after he and Bill split. He wound up getting sponsorship to subsidize his programs. But anyhow, by 1936, they've made their way down to, they've been disassociated with Texas Water Crystals, and they've gone to work for Crazy Water Crystals, and fallen under the management or agency or whatever it was of a fellow named Byron Parker, who used to book on a circuit between Raleigh, North Carolina and Atlanta, Georgia. And at that time, Byron was also handling the Hired Hands, Snuffy Jenkins and Pappy Sherrill's act. May have had to do with Homer and the Briar Hoppers. You know, he was just one of the local P.T. Barnum hustler promoter, Colonel Tom Parker's types of that era. Anyhow, this makes its way from 1930 to 1936, and the selection that I just played for you a little while ago, Long Journey Home, when we came into this thing about the Monroe Brothers, they wound up going into a studio in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it was actually a makeshift studio from what I know. And they had their first recording session, and it was one of those typical old things where you go in and perform and they make the record off your performance and that's it. There was no multi-tracking. But here's one of the recordings that came from those first sessions, and it was one of the ones that got to be a hit record in the Southeast for them and propelled them to a fairly good next 2 years of performing, traveling, and recording.
Brother, apart from a Savior today, risking your soul for the things that decay. Oh, we'll...
And there you have it. Here's another one we're going to do, and I don't really think it needs, it was just taking a shot at Lester Flatt. A lot of people think Lester Flatt wrote Roll in My Sweet Baby's Arms, but I don't need to know that I need to be doing that in these things. Anyhow, if you want to include it, here's one of the original versions of that.
Ain't gonna work on the railroad, ain't gonna work on the farm. Lay around my shack, slap me rain, come back, and I roll in my sweet baby's arms.
Okay, there you have Roll in My Sweet Baby's Arms. Now, one of the things that happened during those first recording sessions, especially the ones down in Bristol, Virginia, is there was a guy, Ralph Peer, had been running up and down that area, and he wound up educating a lot of these folks into the amounts of money that could be made with the intellectual property rights on songs and tunes. And here's a tune that became an anthem in country music for a long time, and then there was this garage band from out in California managed by a brilliant man named Bill McEwen, who picked up, Bill McEwen had this concept of going in and making a record and including a lot of country music people on it. when they asked Bill Monroe to do it, he said they needed to get a haircut and come back and talk to him then. But anyhow, it wound up being a great shot in the arm for the careers of Doc Watson, Earl Scruggs, Jimmy Martin, and pretty much made the career of Vassar Clements as a super sideman back in that day. It wasn't either right before that or right after that. He came out with Hillbilly Jazz and just, you know, there was one year he recorded with over 100 different artists, and these are the A-list people out there who were getting the airplay. He was a very popular guy. But anyhow, Ralph Peer let these folks know how much money could be made in this, and I'm sure we've all heard A.P.'s song about one of the more miserable scenarios ever painted of some guy standing up beside a window pane with rain dripping off of it, watching him hauling his mama to the graveyard. That's just a delightful thing. Anyhow, here's a song that was copyrighted in 1911. Words, lyrics written by a lady and the music written by a fella. And here's something that the Monroes did I think is one of my favorite songs.
There are loved ones in the glory whose dear form you often miss when you...
Will the circle be unbroken? Somewhere about 1938, the Monroe Brothers decided in their own inimitable fashion, which nobody in the world would know what it was, that they didn't need to be together anymore. There was no fight, as best I can tell. There was no woman that they were fighting on. Bill was already married at this point. I don't know whether Charlie was or not, but Bill's family had started, and they wasn't going to be nothing like that around and all that. Anyhow, I think it was for musical reasons and possibly reasons on, you know, there were reasons on both sides. If you would go back and put your guys in, you know, an outgoing fellow like Charlie, what do you need a moody fella who sometimes will talk to folks and sometimes he won't, beside of you pulling you back with Bill. I think his was more critical of the music or wanting it to be, whatever it was. They separated and they decided that they were going to opposite ends of Tennessee to work. And Charlie settled in around Knoxville, Tennessee, and Bill was headed to the Memphis area, but wound up closer to Little Rock, Arkansas, I think, when it was all said and done. And he started his Bill Monroe and the Kentuckians. Now, y'all notice that I haven't used the term bluegrass as applied to music yet. We've still got a ways to go. All right. The Kentuckians jobbed around. They got their radio shows. They did their this, that, and the other. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I think I heard Bill tell me this, that he had headed, at one point considered going back into the duet format that he and Charlie had, and that was what he was thinking of when he got Cleo Davis to come in the band, who was his first guitar player of note and singer. But he wound up on this program in Atlanta, Georgia that required an entire string band. So that's when he had Art Wooten, I think, or Art Wooten and Cousin Wilbur were added to the group then. Anyhow, I read the stuff. It's all vague to me. Here's what happened. Bill Monroe recorded for me on the day in a record I did called Grounded, Centered, Focused. On the date, the number date of his 55th anniversary on the Grand Ole Opry. And when I asked him about how he got on the Grand Ole Opry, according to Richard Smith, Bill was already at that Atlanta radio show and drove back to Nashville for the audition. After the audition, he went back to South Carolina to get Carolyn and Melissa, who were living in a trailer that was parked at the service station parking lot in either Greenville or Spartanburg, South Carolina, and he went back to Nashville because he was sure he was going to have a permanent job there. When I asked him what he was doing, he told me that he was making his way from Little Rock to Atlanta and stopped off in Nashville, Tennessee, and went to George D. Hayes' office and did the audition on a Monday and got the spot for the next weekend. And when I asked him, what did you do during the week? He said, oh, we just loafered around town. And I said, did you rehearse the band? And he said, no, we was ready. Again, that's what he told me. The other thing is what Richard Smith's book says, which probably has documented dates from the Atlanta thing, and also it makes sense to me about the trailer business and all of that. So anyhow, but regardless of what it is, he did walk into George D. Hayes' office and he auditioned, and they said, come back. All right, now his performance on that weekend, I'm going to do a little something here. Earlier we played a cut of Jimmy Rogers doing one of his songs called Mule Skinner Blues. I'm going to play that beginning for you again. Again, try to pick up if you can on the rhythm in the intro to this, because that's all I'm going to play. And then right after that, we'll repeat, or we'll be repeating it, but it'll be Bill Monroe's version and his first performance on the Grand Ole Opry.
Good morning, Captain. Good morning, Shine. Good morning, Captain. Good morning, Shine.
All right, here's Mule Skinner Blues. At the end of that, Monroe said he got 3 ovations off of it. It didn't sound like that was, oh, I better not say this. That wasn't that audience reaction that I heard. But anyhow, there you have it. There's your Mule Skinner Blues. And you could hear on the beginning that more cryptic way that Bill came into his introduction on the guitar and everything, and the whole difference in the rhythm setup that was under it. Now you got to hear the rhythm of a feller who was just hitting stride with what he's doing. He's in his late 20s. He's on the path to stardom there, and it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time in the country. We were starting to make our way out of that depression that happened. Things picking up of various projects around the country, started putting the country back on its feet. We still hadn't gotten into World War II yet, but things were looking up around the country in general. And with Monroe here, he had a job that put him to work in a big time manner. He had landed on one of those clear channel radio stations, and he was able to take his work directly north and directly south of Nashville. He had a big audience developed down in northern Alabama, and his audience developed up through Kentucky, and then on into the industrial north where the folks in Kentucky had gone to get jobs. And he used to talk about that quite a bit, that was the first ways that he had to go to work. But anyhow, his music was exciting. And there were all these ideas coming into it because he had the full ensemble they had gotten out of the duet arrangement. But anyhow, it's an exciting time. The music ideas are flying. We're getting ready to play you a tune right now where it was just wide open. The vocals on this are like nothing that he did before or since that I can see. It's just a real interesting approach. It sounds like some of the stuff that you used to hear in the more zealous of the Pentecostal churches. But anyhow, here's Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys with Crying Holy Unto My Lord.
Crying holy unto my Lord, crying holy unto my Lord. Oh, if I could, I surely would stand on the rock, Lord, where Moses stood.
It's an exciting time for Monroe then. He hasn't graduated to the stretch limo yet. He's still out there in cars and they're beating down the roads and just doing what all entertainers try to do to sell a song and make it to the next place, I guess. Okay, as a result of the war, musicians started bouncing in and out of Bill's band. One of them most especially was Howdy Forrester, who worked for him a bit back then and was also working with Acuff, but Howdy got drafted into the military and Bill hired Howdy's wife, who played the accordion. Now that's again, his mother had played accordion. And this right here is showing you that there's experimentation going along with musical sound at this point. But he had tried a plectrum banjo player by the name of Jim Andrews for a while. I don't know whether this guy had a comedy shtick or whatever, but the first banjo player of any consequence that he had in the band was a fellow named Dave Aikman, string bean. And he was one of the old-timey two-finger banjo players, not a frailing or clawhammer type player, but played with a thumb and an index finger and get that old clackety-clack rhythmic sound to it. Anyhow, here's some of Monroe's experimentation with music right here in the tune that he did called the True Life Blues. It's an exciting time in the music. And the war's about over now, on the last legs. And Bill has just hired a guitar player who had worked for his brother previously. He hired this fellow named Lester Flatt. And Lester came into the band not having been a tenor singer and mandolin player from Charlie. He joins Bill's band as a guitar player and a lead singer. And you can tell real easy on that his inspiration for vocal work in that day didn't lie in the country music world. He was a crooner. He had that popular music side of him looking to be of Bing Crosby crooning type at that point. So Lester comes in the band. The guitar style that he adapts is a thumb and finger pick rhythm guitar style that Charlie Monroe had used. The real curiosity of the guitar style was it accented neither beat nor backbeat in this music that Monroe did. It was just a wall of guitar sound. It used to be Lester Flatt and Jim McReynolds were about the same in this arena. The only time you ever heard them was when they broke a string and one side of the stage just fell off. Lester's ability at detecting chord changes will get a little bit obvious here in a few minutes when we get into Molly and Ten Brooks, and was carried on through his work in Foggy Mountain Breakdown when he energetically played an E major against an A minor, or an E minor. But anyhow, we got Lester Flatt in the band crooning. He had had 2 years of singing with Monroe. He knew the dialect. Their duet was immaculate. It was absolutely wonderful when they sang together. And somewhere along about the end of 1945, there was this fellow who was the leading exponent of Snuffy Jenkins' banjo style had come to town. He had been working over in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina with Zeke and Wiley Morris and with an act, Lost John, I think, but he was on his way back to work in the cotton mills or the tobacco places or whatever that is if he didn't find him a job playing his banjo. So he comes to Nashville, and after being stood up on a couple of audition appointments. Jim Shoemate finally brings him over to the Grand Ole Opry, and he got to audition with Bill and Lester, and it was Earl Scruggs walked in there, and he played his tune with them and everything, and Bill turns around to Lester and says, "What do you think?" And Lester says, "Well, he can keep up with us." And I suppose the next question was, have you got a white shirt with you? Because that was generally, you know, the way when Chubby Wise came to town, after he did his fiddle thing, the old man didn't say you're hired. He just asked him if he had a clean white shirt with him. So, ready to go on the road. Anyhow, right here's a sound that nothing in country music had before. It was a wall of sound, and it had the energy of one of the most dynamic humans and musical individuals I ever came in contact at the core of it. Here's Bill Monroe, Lester Flatt, Earl Scruggs, Chubby Wise with "Why, Oh Why Did You Wander?"
Oh, why did you wonder? Oh, why did you ever roam? And you know that we always were happy all alone in our old mountain home.
And we are done today.